Welcome to UberCube, the podcast where we discuss all things Cube, but with refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, aka UberBear, and I'm joined by my other host,
Stu, and thanks for joining us.
We have an episode covering, and it's going to be titled The Darkside of Cube, with a focus on balancing hate cards in your Cube environments.
Maybe there's a quote that you can provide that
perhaps
would just give us an idea of what the kind of dark side is that we're talking about.
This is going to be from Return of the Jedi, from the Star Wars saga. The Emperor.
Good. Your hate has made you powerful. Now, fulfill your destiny and take your father's place at my side.
Before we get into the topic, what are we going to do, Anthony?
We're going to do the thing that we always do here at UberCube.
Okay.
And we're going to enjoy our libations of the show.
That's right.
What are you having, Stu? Because we were having twinsies.
Well, we are, and this one was a beer that I actually especially selected for the purpose of this recording. It is a Gizmo Brewworks Coffee Stout. This is right out of Raleigh, North Carolina, and it's darn good stuff.
When he pulled this out of his mini fridge, he got a ooh out of me.
I did. It was like, oh my gosh, I got a Nintendo 64 for Christmas.
Yes.
All right, let's crack it.
One of the things we're going to talk about is going to be balancing the fair volume of hate cards in your cube. A certain net number that you should have before it's too much. Now, what you won't get from this episode is that number. We will work further and dive deeper in this. This is going to be a very top-level episode about balancing the hate within your cube environments. What is a healthy amount and what is too much that you're breaking a strategy?
And I think we need to be quite clear, right? Yes, there are hate cards, right? There are cards that are hateful towards like a particular strategy or archetype. But what we're also probably going to cover is also answers, right? And I think those two words definitely invoke a very different emotional response from either, you know, a drafter or a curator, right? Hate cards, to me, it's like, oh my God, that's just something that's going to be absolutely disgusting. Like I've got a particular archetype that I'm trying to put together, and then someone's got just this one card that's just going to hose whatever I'm trying to do. And then you've got these answer cards, which are much more elegant, much more simple, you know, not quite so severe as the hate cards, but they all, in a sense, are trying to do the same thing, which is stop your opponent doing what he wants to do or she wants to do.
Correct. It runs that fine line of breaking a strategy versus interacting with a strategy. And these are two different ideas.
That's a beautiful way of putting it.
Yeah, so we're going to kind of go over that. But before we do that, we're going to do some categorization. Stu, would you mind taking away the categorizations and explaining what these are so that we have some coinage here to these terms?
Absolutely. So the first one is going to be just repeatable stuff, right? So this is one that is near and dear to me because it's in Anthony's artifact cube.
Once was.
That's
called
correct.
Out for this very reason.
Is Trigon Predator, right? So obviously in a very artifact-centric cube, you've got is it a 2/3 or a 3/2 or a 2/2 flyer? I think it's a 2/3, right?
I think so.
So you got a 2/3 flyer, and every time it hits an opponent, it can destroy an artifact, right? So obviously in a very, very artifact-centric, maybe there's not quite as much creature removal in that cube. Suddenly you've got this repeatable effect that is just incredibly, incredibly powerful. And then you've got static effects, right? And this one is kind of a famous, divisive, is Moat. It's an enchantment. It basically... Oh, what's that? You thought you were playing aggro? You thought you had creatures on the ground that were going to swing? No. Don't think so. Sorry, not today. That, to me, is like the poster child for hate cards.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, a lot
Serves
of people...
no other purpose than to
really,
break a
really
strategy.
doesn't. Like,
and
forget
that's kind
aggro
of the gist
in the
of
cube.
what we're saying here in so many words.
Yes.
If you placed it in a cube, the belief system that it is going to countermand a strategy, whereas it's actually not countering it, it's potentially breaking it.
Correct.
And being potentially unanswerable.
Yep.
Making for a non-game.
Yep.
And that's what you want to avoid in your cube environments, because the key to Magic, as we've talked about on previous occasions, is
interaction.
Correct. And if you take that away from the game, putting it straight, good luck getting players to sit down and want to continue to play.
Exactly.
Even if it's just for that subset, right? That one game where I'm running an aggro deck, maybe I didn't choose to draft any utility. Yes, this is on me. But Stu is literally running hate cards that are just for the sole purpose. They're not even sideboard, main boarded, for whatever reason he's chose that, just breaking my game. Yep. There's no reason for me to continue this fight. No. I'll just scoop it up and play against another opponent.
Yep.
It does create that potential, and that's not what you want in your cube environments. You want to finish the rounds, right? The games.
Exactly.
So these type of cards, buyer beware.
Yes. So the next one is we're going to talk about sideboard relegated. So this is definitely a card that can be incredibly powerful against a particular strategy or archetype, but it's only really good against that one, right? So an obvious one, say maybe would be something like Grafdigger's Cage or
Relic of Progenitus.
Exactly.
And then corner cases, and we kind of talked about this in our pregame, we'll say Disenchant, but I have my arguments against that. Most of these, what's going to be interesting about these terms, repeatable, static, sideboard, and then we're going to go into one here, it's going to be a one-time use. It falls into which environment it's placed in is going to define its level of hate.
Yeah.
As we move through these, you may be thinking to yourself, obviously I think most of the community would say Moat is a very hateful card.
It is.
But if I say we're going to be running Relic of Progenitus, people might be scratching and going, that's not hateful. Well, if you run a graveyard themed cube, it's suddenly become an ultra hate card.
It's the one that you see in pick one of your first pack, and you're either taking it because you want to be able to abuse the heck out of it, or you're taking it because you don't want someone else to be able to just hose your strategy with it.
And that's a good way of weighing and measuring these cards. If you feel as a drafter that you have to take this out of the draft, you have to intentionally hate this because it's going to break you, that's a KPI. That's an indicator that's showing you that is potentially a hate card, if not just breaking your strategy, maybe multiple.
Yeah.
There's a motivation there behind that decision making.
Agreed. Something, Abrade, I think, is a good option for that, right? It destroys an artifact, also can deal 3 damage to a creature. I actually think Abrade is, I don't know if I'd necessarily categorize it as a hate card just because it does destroy artifacts as well as can deal direct damage. But I can see the argument for it, right? In any deck where you're playing red and you might come up against an artifact that you want to get rid of, and plus you've got the option to kill a creature, main deck that more often than not, but...
The reason why I put this in here is we put down one-time usage, but quantity now affects the environment. And then again, let's use my artifact cube, for example. If you ran Naturalize, Disenchant, and Braid, and 25 other effects that are of similar nature, cumulatively, they have become an entire hate strategy versus the environment.
Yep.
And so you have to limit that and know when to draw that back because you're creating non-game scenarios again. Armies must march forward.
Yes.
Right? So... kind of to go over it again, we've categorized repeatable, static effects that are hate cards, sideboard relegated hate cards, and then one-time usage cards, right?
Yep.
Just burn and one and done.
Yep.
But in multipliers, they become detriment to.
They become a hate package rather than just a hate
is a good
piece.
point. That's a good point, actually. So the topics we're going to kind of cover in this particular episode are going to be anti-aggro type of effects, which we kind of said moat in so many words. Anti-artifact, because that scenario's kind of come out with Trigon Predator and other ones like it. And then anti-reanimator graveyard synergies. And this is going to be a very problem-solution driven episode.
Yep.
So we're going to not calling out the cards, it's just calling them hate cards and no good for your environment, but we are going to offer cards that are potential solutions.
And obviously this is just covering these strategies / archetypes, really, when you think about the vast expanse of all different types of cubes, right? If you have an enchantment-based cube, for example, and you've just got an absolute boatload of enchantment removal, again, that's kind of a hate package that you're putting in. Obviously, it's very specific for that cube, but there's a lot of cubes out there.
Right. So before we even go any further, that's the overview, right? Let's talk about a new hot card that's causing a lot of conversation.
It's causing waves.
It's causing waves. And we're going to kind of go through the process. Stu, you want to take this one on, or do you want me to do this one? You call it.
I'll do this one. This is a new card that has just come out recently, early here in 2023, and it is Elish Norn, Mother of Machines. 4 colorless, 1 white for a legendary creature, Phyrexian Praetor. It is a 4/7 with vigilance, and to put it just very simply, it's Panharmonicon and Torpor Orb in a single card. It's not symmetrical. It only affects your opponents. And this card has been like another kind of one of these divisive cards, right? A lot of discussion, a lot of talk on the socials about whether or not this card is maybe a bit of a mistake. I know that actually one of the Sheldon Menery, the EDH guy, was like, man, please don't print this card. I would imagine there's a fair amount of jest there. But it's a fascinating case study in the example of what we're doing right now, right? Because as much as you might look at it and think, oh man. So what it does is if a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, it triggers twice. And also permanents entering the battlefield don't cause abilities of permanents your opponents control to trigger. So immediately, you can start seeing the brainwaves going like, oh man, if I've got any, deck or cube archetype or anything where I'm trying to get multiple triggers, that's great. But now also I'm hosing my opponents. For me, I feel this is a very EDH card and a very medium card at that. But let's talk about it.
We're going to talk about that. So we're going to talk about that. So let's do first Power Vintage Cube. Let's talk on that. Panharmonicon is the doubling trigger side, which most Commander players are very familiar with that, and the occasional Cube players like to incorporate that as well.
That's right.
Torpor Orb has been labeled for a long time as a hate card against any ETB, enter the battlefield triggers.
Correct.
For quite a period now.
Yes.
So this has been the dream of a lot of players, but maybe not for the right reasons, because it does do a lot of things. But let's kind of talk about the pros and cons of this card. So let's start with, I'm going to go cons first, right?
Okay.
In a powered vintage environment, mine in particular, a 540, yes, I do have ETBs, but I am running the Power 9, Fast Mana, Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, all the aboves, right? Black Lotus, it's speed. Without those accelerants that you don't necessarily always get, particularly in my 540 draft environment, because it is 8 players splitting across the cube, you don't necessarily get that pool of that amazing ramp.
Right.
On curve, this is 4 colorless and 1 plains to cast it for a 4/7.
Right.
By the time I get this out in my environment, in an imperfect situation, do I really want to hold back on my Solitudes, my Furies, my Reclamation Sages, etc., to interact with the battlefield so that I can be win more-ish and double down and get them? They're spent by the time that I get this out in that environment. So I think in my powered vintage environment, this card, it'll have some corner case, and we're going to talk about that amazing function. It's going to be kind of feast or famine with this card.
I think it's going to see some play as probably a pretty decent top end for like a mono white aggro. It's only 5 mana and it is a 4/7.
Yeah.
It does have vigilance, so it attacks really well. It defends you really, really well. And obviously, I think the abilities are fine, but I will say this. I've never played Panharmonicon or Torpor Orb in a vintage cube environment. No. And I would never.
And the reason why is because it's a situational type.
It is, exactly.
It's a build around for you. I get that. That could be fun. If you had a heavy blink package, which this is where we're going to draw that line, you're both helping and hurting that package. And that's where the hate's going to come online. We're going to talk about that very shortly. If you had a nice density of cards that have ETB, I can see where you would be encouraged to want to run this. But at the same time, are you removing the fun from your environment by shutting down the interactions of your opponents? Are you getting memorable games? Do you want this just to be as cutthroat an environment as possible, where the other player across the table isn't really playing Magic the Gathering?
I think I'm judging it based on, like, when you look at those two abilities.
Yeah.
Is blinking a big part of the strategy in my cube? And if it is, I probably don't want it. And if permanents entering the battlefield, if ETB triggers are a big part of the cube, I probably don't want it either, because it's, I can understand there's certain strategies, right? So we'll talk about Entomb, right? That's an obvious, I want to pick that card because it's the best pick one, pack one, in my opinion, for a reanimate, right? Or, whatever. But I'm picking this just because I don't want someone else to have it, if those kind of strategies are present in a cube, or I'm picking it maybe later on if it comes around because I'm trying to build around it. But am I looking at that thinking, man, I'm so excited to play that card?
No.
It's not exciting to me. It's just, I want to play it so someone else doesn't, and just in case I can. And I'm going to try and build around it if I get it very early on, because it
creates
can be strong
that.
enough.
Also, problem with this card is situational.
It's exactly.
You're under the assumption that your opponent's even going to have ETBs that you wish.
Correct.
I mean, a Gruul Stompy isn't going to care. I mean, granted, 4/7, good, right?
I'm going to care about a 4/7
base stats. I'll let you have it.
4/7 bottom.
But what I mean is, you're under the assumption that I'm running this card is that I have a Torpor Orb situation on the other side of the field. I think that's presumptuous, right? This isn't going to have that perfect package. This is going to be a haymaker at times. Other times, it's going to be just the dead of winter. Nothing's going to happen. But let's talk about some of the situations where this could get disgusting, right? Let's talk about some of those haymakers. Perforos.
Yeah. Pretty disgusting.
Those triggers would be doubled, be disgusting. Field of
4
the
damage
dead,
a time.
Field of the Dead. But I mean, by then, look how far we went into the game. We have to ramp into this. I can see that, but I'm not encouraged to run this in a Field of the Dead deck, but it is splashable. You could make a valid point because it's only one planes. You could splash this in a deck, and you could do something and incorporate this with like Omnath. The Locus of Creation, right?
Yep.
You could do some dirty stuff with this card. But it's still not enough to justify that in the environment, because I think this card has the potential to hurt some exchanges or give like false...
Bad signposts.
Signpost. It's something that you think that they're going to be available, a huge blink package, and the opponent's drafting for it, but maybe you don't run Mold Drifter anymore.
Right.
But let's move on to a situation where a card like this, and that was talking about in my 540, which I did some math on it. It turns off about 17% of the cube, which is not insignificant. It basically powered 540, disables 90 triggers for the opponents, and it doubles 86 of my targets.
Actually call that incredibly significant. Now,
it's probably too significant.
It's argument. I think you could make the argument either way, right? So what exactly does it turn off? Right, because not every ability is created equal.
Yeah.
Right, so it is a lot, and it does have a lot of effect. Is that 540 cube and that 17%, does it include any lands, for example?
It does. I counted it. So Torpor Org would be about 90 of that effect.
Okay.
Panharmonicon would be 86, so it's almost on parity.
Yes.
I mean, it's kind of making a case for itself, but it's situational. I don't know if I may test this at some point, but I'm not feeling it right now.
Okay.
There's other cards that I'd rather run in that 5 slot.
I might be really completely way off with this card. It doesn't excite me. It would excite me if I had, like I've said, if I had a commander deck where where those abilities were a big deal, I would want to run it, but I don't, so I'm not super excited.
Now, let's talk about, we're going to go over some cards here in a minute, which will all be included in the show notes.
Sure.
My La Femme Fatale does run a steady blink package, and in that blink package, it's almost on parity with what we talked about. Although it's a 360, we're looking at 64 targets that are blink spells that are rendered obsolete by this card. In this particular environment, 64 of the targets that are blink spells or some kind of interaction with a blink environment or a trigger, they're completely turned off.
Okay.
This card would be devastating in that environment. And she is a female, so she qualifies from my thematic perspective.
Absolutely.
But she would be backbreaking. Insta-ban for that cube because it's turning off an entire... Because when you run that strategy, typically, it's going to be utilitarian and everybody around the table is going to have a little piece of blink. There's no just one dominant blink player, but it's going to turn off a lot of strategies.
It's 5 mana, and obviously you don't have things like Soul Ring and mana crits and stuff like that. There's no marks or
so it's
Black
on curve
Lotus.
again, right?
So you're probably hoping to get out on curve, and that's maybe another consideration, right? Is at what point does the blink strategy start to not really worry about its individual ability turned off, right? Because if you're trying to power those blink strategies through the first 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 turns, maybe it's not quite as hateful. But if the plan is that you're playing a longer strategy, that it's a bit more grindy, then I can see it being very problematic.
I'm not interested in testing that environment. It's just a lot to deal with, and it could be harmful to a heavy blink strategy. Yeah. Whereas in my Powered Vintage Cube, it could maybe be functional, I guess is what the takeaway here. It has moments where it's going to be amazing, and other moments where it's going to be backbreaking in non-games, and people aren't... It's never going to be... It's never going to be consistent.
No.
I do believe that's the problem with this card. So let's go over some examples of interactions here that are going to be turned off, that will be rendered. And this is going to be across the different environments. Ephemerate would be turned off from your opponent's standpoint, and it would be doubled for yours. So anytime you use that card, it's disgusting. Ether Channeler is another example.
Yep.
For 2 colorless and 1 blue, you get a creature human wizard, 2/1. When Ether Channeler enters the battlefield, choose 1. Create a 1/1 white bird creature, token with flying. Return another target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, or draw a card.
So obviously the return to owner's hand is probably what I'm looking at 9 times out of 10, right?
Because that's locks now.
That's where exactly.
It's disgusting.
Yes, thank you.
Venser locks. So then we got Emery, Lurker of the Lock, which would be really powerful both in powered vintage environments as well as artifact cubes, where you're going to be doubling down on that.
Yep.
A little bit more tame, but still strong, and I thought it was noteworthy as Thraben Inspector.
I'm not worried about Thraben Inspector because it's a 1-drop.
It's not, but it's worth noting that she would double down. By then, though, it's already played out. This card's already been spent.
It probably is, depending on, again, how grindy of a deck that you're playing. But if you've got this dirty Phyrexian Torpor Panharmonicon creature out, and then, maybe you're top decking, and all of a sudden you've got a Thraben Inspector that now creates 2 clues and allows you to get 2 cards out of it. It's not nothing.
Let's get over to disgusting here. It's going to be Solitude.
Let's not talk about that.
And Fury, for that matter.
It is disgusting.
Any of those free cards, man,
Yes.
you double down on that trigger. That's a real problem. It may be awesome. It may not be. I don't know. I've considered actually putting this in my cube just to test it, but I don't know. Powered Vintage 540, but definitely not my La Femme Fatale.
No. Way too strong. Can you imagine with
strong.
Fury, now you're doing 8 damage, spread across the board. And,
this card's really hard to evaluate. I know people are all over the fence with this topic. You probably have heard, based on the tone that we're having here, I am undecided as well. I think it might be worth a go on a Friday night to just put this in as an extra card. I kind of want to see what happens, because I think evaluation of this card is very difficult.
Which, are you talking about Fury, or are you talking about that card right there?
I'm referring to, Solitude and Fury are already there, but I'm talking about putting Elishnorn in my Powered Vintage.
Sure.
To give it a whirl, just to see what happens. I do not know. I think it's worth testing.
I think so. I think anything's worth testing.
Everything's worth testing.
Anything that's worth testing that gets us cubing.
And then we got Rex Sage. We got those type of effects that are get doubled down. And we kind of already talked about Perforos, God of the Forge, which would be disgusting with Elishnorn in play.
Of course.
And then Field of the Dead, disgusting. But this.
I mean, think about with Perforos. You only need 5 other creatures to enter the battlefield.
Game.
And it's game.
It's game. I don't know if we're encouraging or discouraging people to add this to their cube.
I feel like we're kind of speaking out of both sides of our mouth, but that's okay.
It's great.
We can do that.
This is great hate.
But and I like this next one. So the next one is Field of the Dead, right? So a little bit of a condition that you need to have 7 or more lands with different names with Field of the Dead, but suddenly you're now creating double of your 2/2 black zombie creature tokens whenever you put a land onto the battlefield.
Land, which is really
again,
hard.
that's not nothing.
It's not nothing. It's gross.
Of course it is.
And then
fetch land, crack it, put another land in.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
Yuck.
Gross.
Yeah, gross. Grody. All right, so this is not the Elishnorn episode, but what we wanted to take away from that is you can see where it could be
problematic.
It could be problematic,
Very
just based on
much
the
so.
discussions we just had and how all over the place that was. It may require some testing, but I will tell you with total confidence, in my heavy blink package cube, it's a no-go. It can't be in there because it serves the sole purpose of making one person win more and the other one just not play the game.
Yes.
Whereas in a Powered Vintage environment, if you have the slots and you're greater than, I'd say 630 plus, 540, I feel a little tight in my group, start cutting for that.
I think 540 is so optimized at this point that you're really going to have to work a card like that in there.
Yeah. Unless I just wanted to cheat it in for a playtest, which is an idea for curators. If you ever want to test a card and you don't want to make a cut,
I'm going to guarantee it's going to be on the Moto Cube because they tend to add all the hot new cards to the Moto Vintage
We'll get
Cube.
some. We'll get to see some play reps dropping down with that. Maybe we'll see. We'll get a news flash from ChiliMTG here in a couple of weeks. It says, "Oh, everybody put Elishnorn in your cube." Next thing you know, it's up. The card's spiking.
Well, our good friend J-Bro, Jonathan Brostaff, he loves his mono white. So if it's in there, this is a public call for J-Bro. Get your Elishnorns in your mono white decks, and let's see how it performs.
All right, so let's get back to the topic as far as the cube. So we kind of talked about the categorizations we did before, and this is going to be kind of a static effect. And what we're going to do is problem solution based. So we're going to kind of first start out with the aggro hate portion of this conversation. We preluded with it earlier, and we talked about moat. Moat being creatures without flying can't attack. It's an enchantment. For those that aren't familiar, 2 colorless and 2 planes, and it's a really old, really expensive card. And I ran it for a little while in my Powered Vintage, and it led to some non-games.
Yes.
I just shut down an entire package that had no means. I mean, they had to go to their sideboard to even try to get back in the game. Because typically they just want to go sideways with Savannah Lion-esque type creatures.
I think Moat is really should be, at the best of times, limited to Vintage Cube, right? I think if you've got some kind of thematic cube and you can justify putting Moat into it, I would love to see it. I mean, it's great if you can make it work. Whoever out there, if you've got a thematic cube, a non-vintage power level cube, and you've got Moat in there, and your play group's like, yeah, man, this is a great card. I'd love to see it. I really would, because I think it's good to see if you've got situations like that where a card like that can work. But to me,
like a cube with nothing but flyers in it, for example.
Like a cube with nothing but flyers. and then maybe it's not doing so much.
It's not doing so much.
So what about a card that we can do that provides a similar effect?
And this is Blind Obedience. This is a very commander-centric, and if you were a commander
hate
player...
this card.
Yeah, most people do. I love it. I hate it. I get it. It's a pillow fort type card, but a lot of commander players will have played with this or have experience with it, and when they want to introduce themselves into the Cube community, this is a card that may tag along with them.
Yes.
Because they have fond memories of 4-player games where this preserved their life total. The problem with Blind Obedience, and for those that aren't familiar, for 1 colorless and 1 white, you get an enchantment. Extort. Extort's the one where whenever you cast a spell, you can play. It breaks all the weird rules of Magic. You can play
It's reminder text.
Hybrid reminder text of black and white.
That's right.
And you can ping them for a life. Your opponents take 1, you gain 1, blah, blah, blah. Artifacts and creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tap.
I feel like this is much more manageable in a cube environment because you're only playing 1 versus 1. And I feel like I own this card. It's in at least one of my decks. I haven't done so yet, but I want to get rid of this card because in a multiplayer environment, I've actually found that it's not always the answer to everything that I kind of envisage it to be when I first put it onto the battlefield. And there's been plenty of times when it's hurt me just as much as it's been a benefit. But it's pretty good in a 1v1 environment. You know, you've got 1 player, 1 opponent across from you, and all of their creatures, all of their artifacts come in tapped. It can buy you multiple turns.
If you're asking yourself, Anthony, why do you have this on the list, hating out? It's because it causes your opponent to have to reach their sideboard to respond. As in, it is an enchantment. It's harder to interact with. On top of that, it is doing life gain scenario, life swap. So it is hating out your aggro package. It's making it so it's non-existent. They hit you for 2, you take it back, and you're making it so that you're slowing down, stagnating their entire board. If you're going to run cards like this is Anthony speaking, my opinion, and Stu may agree, you have to ask yourself, if I'm running cards that hate a package so much, why am I running the package to begin with? That's a core element question. If I dislike aggro in my cube, why am I running cards to hate on it? Why not just remove the problem?
I disagree with that viewpoint, and I will say there needs to be answers to, I would say, sort of price points within the archetype, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think Reanimate is a great idea for this, or a great example of this. I don't think in a vintage cube environment, it's a bad idea to have cards that are anti-graveyard strategy cards. Yes, they only work against 1 archetype, but there's no way on earth I'm ever going to advocate for Reanimator being removed really from any cube, right? And you've got it in a couple of your cubes. It doesn't mean you have to be putting Gristlebrand or Archon of Cruelty out, but there's still a strategy there, and it can be a fun one, and it can be a good experience for the drafters. And I don't want to just say, hey, let's just get rid of all the Reanimate cards because of 1.
I was being a little bit extremist there.
You tend to do that.
Well, no, I was making a point. If you hate the archetype so much, don't run cards that hate against it or shut it down.
So holistically.
But there are solutions. So we talked about Moat and Blind Obedience. Let's go over some cards that you may scratch your head and go, oh, are these really safer? They are. They're safer options, and that's what we're going to talk about. Thalia, Heretic, Cathar. For 2 colorless and 1 plains, you get a legendary creature, Human Soldier, 3/2, first strike. Creatures and non-basic lands your opponents control enter the battlefield tap.
And this is obviously an easier card because it's a creature. It dies much easier than an enchantment or an artifact.
And it does the effect of Blind Obedience as well as it attacks. It attacks from the aggro standpoint, but can also be a control mechanism for you shutting down aggro.
Absolutely.
And can be removed. So it kind of is multi-tiered.
It's better but worse.
It's better but worse, but has a lot going on. It can play in multiple archetypes. Whereas Blind Obedience is on the I dislike aggro, I want to hide behind this so I can ultimate my planeswalkers, etc.
Sure.
Thalia Thar is a much safer answer without shutting down and breaking a package.
I love that card.
I love this
I
card
love all the Thalias.
And it's a perfectly safe card. And
yes.
it's strong, but it's not impervious.
No.
And that's what's so great about it. And this one's going to be a little dumpy, but makes the point. Wall of Roots.
Absolutely.
You want to stop aggro? Put a big old fat do nothing wall in front of it, or something. We had First Strike as a shutdown.
There's Wall of Omens as well. You get a card when Wall of Omens
Wall
comes
of Flowers, Wall of Roots, and we're using the word wall, but it doesn't have to be a wall. But does this deal with aggro? 100%. Guess what doesn't get through that? Ragavan.
That's correct.
He might climb it because he's a monkey.
We played Chris's, our friend Chris Moore, Samich, Omega Man. He's got about 100 names, but a good friend of ours, an incredible.
Doesn't he? Now that you
He
mention
does. Wonderful cube guy. But we played his peasant cube last night, and he had a very aggressive strategy, and I had a 1-3, and that's all it took. And obviously, in a peasant environment where you're not banging Ragavans and Thalias and stuff down, something just with a toughness of 3 that was hosing all those 2/2 creatures, that's enough. I wasn't doing anything degenerate. I just played a 1-3, and it was hateful towards his deck, obviously from him trying to take my life total down, but a very fair play, and that's exactly what those cards are doing.
So to tie off the aggro as a problem package, right? Some simple solutions are bolster or manage your mid-range. Add cards in there that are not impervious to damage. They're capable of being destroyed, but are able to thwart or slow down if you have an overly... You don't want to stymie the package. You don't want to break it. You want to allow it to play the game because some people want to play a very aggro-centric deck. So you want to be mindful of that. So back to the cards like Blind Obedience and Moat, they straight up just say you will not play aggro as long as these cards exist.
Yeah.
And you must have an answer. And what if they don't? You now have a non-game once that drops on the field.
Agreed.
And that's a consideration as a curator. That's the point of this episode. Better solutions are things that I want to say is capable of being interacted with from a point of view of the opponent. This will stop you from having non-games, but interaction, which we've said for the 1,000th time, is the key to Magic, the core of the game, right? The next, would you mind taking on this next category?
So this next one is Artifact Hate, and this one is an interesting one because at CubeCon 2022, Anthony took along his Artifact Cube, and it was a featured cube, which meant that we got some of the big brains, the much better Magic players that I would ever be playing
Ranger
it.
featured it.
Sam Black played it.
Sam Black played it. Andy Mangold covered it. So did Justin Parnell. I mean, it was through a microscope. I was like, oh god. It
was good to get some feedback from players like that, right? From some much bigger brains than I'll ever have. So these are a couple of cards we're going to talk about, and these are specifically Artifact Hate cards. And the first one is Collector Oof. This is a 1 colorless, 1 green for a creature, Oof. It's a 2/2, and it's simply activated abilities of artifacts can't be activated. That is hate. Right there. Yes, you can say it's on a creature. Yes, creatures are removable. But the fact that you just can't activate any artifact abilities, it's not quite moat because it's a creature, but it's pretty disgusting.
Yeah, so you've heard me do my adage of if someone calls you a horse once, well, that was Chris Moore, a.k.a. Sandwich. He's like, dude, that's a horse. I'm like, no. And then
but if they call you a horse
Parnell's
twice,
calling it out, and he's like, that's a horse. I'm like, no. And then Andy Mangold, he just said it straight. No, dude, that's a horse.
That's a horse.
I'm like, oh my god, it's a horse.
It's a horse.
I went home. I'm like, I'm cutting this. I'm a horse.
So
I love this card. But
so I love it too.
I had to cut it, and this art is sick. And he's got a bird cage, and there's no bird in it, which is super weird. But
massive orange, like
dude, he's like a Fraggle. He's literally like an evil Fraggle.
It's like a Fraggle.
It's a
exactly
Fraggle.
what
It's a
it
Fraggle.
is.
Jim Henson totally made this evil dark Fraggle.
Yeah, agreed. So what about as an alternative to this?
It's not an alternative. As a secondary hate card.
Do you think this is so hateful?
It is, but I love it.
It's a different kind of hateful to me.
Yeah.
But I agree it is very hateful. So the next one is, again, going with the artifact theme, is Kataki War's Wage. This is a 1 colorless, 1 white legendary creature, Spirit. It's a 2/1, and all artifacts have, at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice this artifact unless you pay 1. So it's basically Tabernacle for artifacts.
Yeah. This is still in my artifact cube. I've chose to leave this one for multiple reasons. One, it's a 2/1. 2,
easy to kill.
It's easy to kill. The tax, granted, the tax is problematic. I get it, but it's not the end all be all. Strategies, there's a lot of removal in the cube. You can interact with and kill it. Oath was kind of turning off a lot of signets and equipment strategies. And watching it, it was sobering to me to see this. Watching players play it, Sam Black, etc., on camera, and lines of play that were happening where people simply couldn't equip Loxodon Warhammer, which is an awful card.
They
couldn't put it on. Wasn't able. They couldn't tap their signets to ramp. The game was becoming just non-games the minute this card dropped out until they got a removal spell. And whereas Kataki is attacks, if you just let it kind of, you can play around that.
You have a little bit more choice with it.
You can get ahead of the tax. It doesn't break you. It kind of, I think there's some player agency still embedded in that card. People may disagree with that statement. Matter of fact, I will ask. I would like the community to give us feedback once you've heard this episode. Am I wrong on this one? But I think that is a safe choice, whereas the Oath, I think, is not a safe choice. Now, we're going to provide you some, in my opinion, some safer versus the two we just talked about, one I literally said I kept, which is comedy at best, right? Is the hum of the Radix. I'm saying this is safer. For 2 colorless and 2 forest, you get an enchantment. Again, interaction, point of problem. But in my artifact cube environment, I have disenchant effects to deal with this, etc. Each artifact spell costs 1 more to play for each artifact its controller controls. Controller controls is fun to say. Why would they do that and not do some synonyms?
I think it would be really disgusting if it was for each artifact on the battlefield.
Artifacts.
You know, again, it's you're only impacting your own ability to play spells, right? The more artifacts you put out, the more problems you have.
It's stymieing your opponent, but not breaking your opponent. In my opinion, I have not seen this card breaking thing. I think this is a safer choice in an artifact environment if you wanted to tone back the aggression or the ramping speed of your opponent so that you can catch up and balance the game. I could be wrong, but I've played this multiple times, and that's the lines of play I've seen. It hasn't been harmful. It's kind of just made it, well, until you deal with this, you're gonna pace with me. We're playing fair magic until you solve this problem. And generally in this cube, people solve it pretty quickly.
Yes.
Well, that's why I cut Trigon Predator, so I can keep doing this. And the next one, this is an oldie but a goodie. We talked about it. Hum of the Radix is going to be a static effect. It's just always sitting there. It's doing this thing. It's becoming cumulative as they add more. Whereas Disenchant is going to be that one-time effect. It's that turn and burn, right?
And there's so many of those.
It's safe. You don't have to put
collect
thousands of these. Yeah.
Unravel the Ether, Oxidize. Like there's so many anti-artifact, anti-enchantment, whatever.
Which leads to the next thing. When you're running an environment that's key to the strategy, we'll use an artifact cube environment. You want to be very mindful of how many of these you have, right? You don't want to put so much anti-artifact strategy into your artifact cube that it's no longer an artifact cube, but just rocks blowing up all over the field. No one's playing the game. So that balancing the equation takes a lot of time. I will include in the show notes a copy of both my Powered Vintage Cube, all the cards we talked about, in addition to my Artifact Cube, which is about to be the featured cube on Cube Cobra.
Very nice.
Probably by next week,
Congrats.
or at least when this recording comes out. And it'll just kind of, you don't want to break the environment by adding too many hate cards. Which moves over to our next hate section. Steve, would you mind taking away this one?
Yeah, so we touched on this briefly early in the episode. So again, going back to graveyard hate. So again, this can really hose a lot of strategies, right? So in a vintage environment, you can look at things like Reanimate or Storm. A lot of the times is very, very dependent whether or not you're playing like a Yawgmoth's Will kind of strategy or Underworld Breach, Brain Freeze kind of strategy. But there's definitely ways to be hateful on graveyard strategies without being really hateful.
Yeah.
On graveyard strategy. So we kind of picked a couple of cards here. The first one, very, very simple. Relic of Progenitus. 1 colorless for an artifact. It has tap. Target player exiles a card from his or her graveyard. Or you can tap 1 colorless and exile Relic of Progenitus and exile all cards from all graveyards and draw a card.
It's not a Leyline of the Void where
it's not
static. Versus this card is immediately relegated to a sideboard.
Leyline isn't. None of the Leylines are playable vintage because you're not going to get them in your opening hand.
I wanted to give a tangible example of a card that would just sit out there and just hate an entire strategy out of the game. Relic of Progenitus is on the cusp of hating Reanimator, but until you know they have Reanimator, you're going to sideboard this in.
You will, and honestly, the fact that what I love about Relic is the fact that if you're playing Reanimate, you're not doing it with one reanimation spell.
Yeah.
You're not doing it with one way to get creatures into the graveyard. You're not doing it with one fatty creature that you're trying to reanimate, right? So, as an opponent, you're probably going to crack it if you have it available the first time that they try and reanimate anything, right? Stands to reason, but that's it.
I'm going to recommend you don't run this card at all. I'm going to say that it is in there for the sole purpose of breaking graveyards.
It is.
It is so hateful towards graveyards that I do not believe that I don't run it in any of my environments that has a graveyard theme. Matter of fact, I don't run it all except for out in Commander. This card, I'm going to give you a softer, more.
I think it's fair. I think it's a
cuddly
very, very
version
fair
of a
card.
card that's more, I don't think it's fair at all. I think if you put it in there in a cube that has a graveyard centric theme, it just exists as a sideboard card to kill a graveyard.
It does.
That's all it is. It's really
It does.
immediately.
But it's not unfair, right? It's not like you're paying 1 mana for every creature.
Yeah, it's
instead
one
gets
time
exiled.
because it gets exiled. I get that argument.
And you do have the repeatable, like, tap to exile a card. Like, don't get me wrong, that it's not a useless effect. But obviously, the pay 1 to exile all graveyards.
And they get to choose too. So, I mean, the opponent's not going to choose Grizzlebrand. They're going to choose a fetch land.
A fetch land, exactly. So I think that's... I think Relic of Progenitus
I think it's a bad card in the cube. I'm gonna make that bold statement. What I mean by that, yeah, because it's gonna hate Storm out and it's gonna hate Reanimator out, but there's just better cards to manage this.
It's not gonna. It's gonna have to be.
It hits your LEDs.
You're gonna have to be very. Yeah, but again, it's only gonna hit it if that's the only card that's in the graveyard, right? So if you've cracked an LED and you've dumped your hand,
yeah, I understand.
All you need to have is one irrelevant card, right? One fetch land, one anything that's not useful to going ahead and going off and winning that turn, right? So I don't think, yes, the cracking to exile everything can be problematic, but at that point, like, I'm trying to play everything at instant speed anyway.
Let's go to safer, cuter. Scavenging Ooze.
Skoos. Love me some Skoos.
Skoos is a sweet card. And actually, I think this is the better option, and it's more versatile, and has utility built in it.
It's also the best art that you've got in the show notes.
And it doesn't care about just graveyards primarily. It just interacts in a way that it doesn't matter which package you're running. It's for 1 colorless and 1 green. You get a creature Ooze. Pay 1 forest. Exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, put a 1/1 counter on Scavenging Ooze, and you gain 1 life.
It's interesting.
It's a 2/2.
It's interesting as well that you don't like Relic, even though exiling a single card is a tap effect.
It's not the single card that's problematic for me. It's the exile all cards from graveyards.
Okay, but you have the choice as a player with Scavenging Ooze.
My problem with these 2 cards,
and it's repeatable.
Well, it is. It's repeatable, but it also doesn't have to fit into an anti. You can get a fetch land. You can get a creature. It doesn't care that you're playing Reanimator. It just wants to stabilize.
I don't disagree with that, but here's the thing, right? Reanimate. I know you have Reanimate packages in some of your cubes, right? So, and I don't want to belittle non-vintage power level Reanimate strategies, but obviously when you've got the ability to reanimate a Grizzlebrand or an Archon of Cruelty, that's really where the power of Reanimate is, right? Where you're putting something on the battlefield that costs 7 or 8 mana, for example. I agree. Right? So the ability for Skoos to be able to answer that is very significant. Outside of that, Skoos isn't vintage playable anymore. It's just not. Or maybe it's incredibly borderline. I disagree
with you just for the ability to stabilize on the 1 life. See, Skoos doesn't care whether or not you're running Reanimator or not.
But it only cares about whether you're running Reanimator.
No, it doesn't.
It really does.
It really doesn't.
Do you think that?
I will remove your creature, and then I will just gain 1 life with Skoos and make it bigger and make it into a beater. I'll run this in a big green deck with 0 consideration of what you... I'll mainboard this. Versus Relic of Progenitus is not a mainboard card. It's immediately a sideboard card.
It's a sideboard card, 100%.
Looking for 2 strategies to hate them out.
Exactly. Yes, you're right, 100%.
That's what I'm trying to say in so many words.
Yes.
You're going to hate out Storm or hate out Reanimator. Whereas Skoos doesn't care that you have any of those. It's just going to be a utility piece that's going to play the game, and every once in a while, sure, I'm going to get a target. I might get a Grizzlebrand, but I didn't even know I was going to be matched against you. Right? That's my whole point of this conversation. So I think it's a safer option because it doesn't require another archetype to even play the game.
It's not just hating against one archetype.
No, it's just playing the game.
It's good if you kill a creature, you exile it, you gain a life, you make it bigger. Yes, I agree with that.
Yeah, and you sit down and you go, what are you running?
So for a safe option,
and I go, I got Skoos, and you're like, oh my god.
Yes.
Yeah, I get it, but that's the difference. I didn't do it on purpose. Whereas if I go, I'm running Relic of Progenitus, I hate your deck.
I will agree with that. Yes, there we go. Yeah. I will definitely agree with
that.
Got
one, Anthony.
You did. You did.
All right, let's kind of scroll down through some other things. We're going to move into our summary. All right, so what we've kind of talked about to kind of tie this all up is we talked about cards that were static, one-time, repeatable effects, and whether or not you should have a good balance in your cube environment. What was too much? What was a safer choice in your environment?
I think what we've come up with fairly quickly is that the very static, powerful effects are the ones that need to be treated with the most care.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. Another one, too, that I think we got out of this conversation going sideways is enchantments can be a little bit problematic.
Enchantments can be problematic.
If it's a static effect that's going to be impacting and hating on an archetype, i.e. Moat and other ones like it, it could be a problem.
Yes.
There was also some good learning opportunities for me, as we talked about during CubeCon. I got to watch other people play my cube, and I got to see some interactions that if you had asked me 2 months before whether or not Trigon Predator was a problem for that cube, I would have argued tooth and nail that it wasn't, but then I got to watch people run amok with it, right?
It absolutely ruined me 2 games in a row by our good friend Christian Anderson, who had it out. And sometimes you just draw the right card at the right time.
Yeah.
Right? There's times where you just get that right answer right when you need it, and you think, man, that's pretty awesome. But in a cube that is so focused on the artifacts, there isn't a time where getting that out, unless you're playing against someone that's just gone absolutely hellbent on the anti-artifacts and just trying to play as little of them as possible, that's going to be a house.
I think we kind of tie it off with a lot of these ideas. Don't put too much hate in here. You can look at a lot of my recommendation. Go out to Cube Cobra, look at other people's environments where they've sat there for a while. They've had a chance to solve a lot of these equations. You will see the balance start to happening if you looked at like White Wolf's, or you looked at Chill MTG's, or you can reference some of my cubes or Sandwich's cubes. For that matter, Andy Mangold's cubes. There's a lot of cubes out there that have been balanced, and people have taken the time to make sure that there's not too much hate, that an archetype is not shut down because of singular cards, etc. A lot of thought has went into it, and it is a very trial and error type of, there's no one shot solution to this. If you're wondering if, well, should I run 13? No, it's based on percentages. It's based on paying attention to lines of play in your opponents and getting feedback from your opponents.
Yeah, exactly. And like, how much are those hate cards? This is a big one for me. How much are they countering the fun? This is something that we talk about a lot. Yes, you're playing 1v1, you're playing to win, but you do want to promote, I would say, at least I would. I know that, Anthony, you speak about this a lot, as does all the people that have cubes in our group. They all talk about the fact that they want the experience to be fun for all the drafters. Is it countering the fun? Is it stopping the fun in some manner that you just really are not interested in?
And then 2 questions you want to kind of ask yourself is, are they inhibiting you from advancing the game? Are they sideboard, or are they going main board? Because these are questions when you're adding cards to your cube. What strategy would want this? Which one's going to actually hate this? What is it going to decimate? What strategy is going to get cut to pieces from me adding this card? It's just something you ask yourself before you put it in the sleeves and add it to your cube environment. Anything else you want to add to that?
And there's a point that you mentioned earlier. If an archetype or a strategy needs deliberate hate cards, should you have the archetype at all? And I'm going to say that this is extremely context-based, right? Because I do believe that it's necessary for you to have answers to certain strategies, right? I do think you need to pay a lot of care to not just having cards that completely hose or hate out a strategy, but just having answers. And I think this is where you need to make sure that you're getting that balance, right, between what is an answer and what is a hate card, right? I don't know if there's many hate cards, that certainly none of the ones that we've talked about during this episode that I'm like, yeah, I really, really like that card. But there's plenty of answers that I'm more than happy to draft a Disenchant. I'm more than happy to draft a Scavenging Ooze, but I'm never touching Moat. Sorry, Moat lovers, but you're on your own.
Team Moat!
And also, like, just think of the density as well, like... and I think that's something there's another episode brewing with this. We'll talk about this at another point. This is very, very specific, but we'll talk about this at a later date. Is the density and what it answers as far as what even the entire cube is concerned, but certainly you can macro it down to an individual archetype, is how many answers, right? Again, Trigon Predator is not a hate piece. It kind of is, but it isn't. It's repeatable. You know what? Whatever. It is a hate.
It's a good case. It's a good
great
case
case
study
study
for in the right environment.
In the right environment, and
like
in the right
an artifact cube, Trigon Predator is problematic.
Yes.
Elish Norn is problematic in a blink cube.
Correct.
Or anything that hosts a large.
And there's
blink.
a lot of these hate
Moat
cards
is problematic
like that.
in a huge.
Yes.
Aggro
Anything
synergy,
aggro
even
synergy.
mid-range,
Yep.
anything on the ground, anything that runs on the ground, right?
Agreed.
That's just how you look at these cards.
Yep.
And it's hard to see it until you look at the cube from 40,000 feet in the air, and or you ask from feedback from other players. Hey, can you look at my cube and offer me any recommendations? And don't be surprised when somebody goes, well, I don't know if your aggro package can live through blind obedience.
Right.
It's good feedback because it's probably true.
Could be.
Other than that, this has been a fun episode. We kind of just covered Emperor Palpatine's favorite topic, the dark side of Cube.
Good. I can feel your anger. I am defenseless. Take your weapon. Strike me down with all of your hatred, and your journey towards the dark side will be complete.
Into your anger.
Other than that, we're going to
That was terrible, but yeah. So as always, thank you to everyone, to all of our listeners. If you enjoy the show, then please, we would appreciate giving us a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform. Again, whatever you can do to get us out there to more Cube enthusiasts, we really appreciate it. If you would like to support the show, then you can use our Inked Gaming affiliate link if you're looking to buy some really cool playmats, dice bags, mouse pads, any kind of custom art stuff for your cube, your EDH decks. Go check them out. They've got some wonderful products available. We are reachable at Twitter. If you like anything or you want to talk about anything with this episode, future episodes, past episode, you can reach us at UberCubeMTGPod at Twitter. Or reach out to us via email. We love to read emails from our listeners, and you can reach us at UberCubeMTGPodcast at gmail.com. And as always, Anthony, tell us about the Patreon.
So the Patreon is going swimmingly.
Swimmingly.
Actually, I've got something pretty cool coming out soon that's going to be connected to that. Probably by the time this episode comes out, I would have already tweeted. I am keeping something super cool for the community in my pocket. I've now talked about this for 3 episodes. I can't wait. It's going to be awesome.
It's been a long time now.
It's in progress.
Make it happen.
Some of these things
All right,
take
good.
a little longer than
Yes, they do.
others, but that's okay. It's worth the wait. Good news coming down the pipe here soon from UberCube.
Yes,
but
indeed.
until then, we're going to say the thing that we always say at UberCube is Happy
Happy cubing.
cubing!